He stood up at the biggest board meeting of my career and presented my project as if it were his. I sat there with my heart pounding, watching months of my work unfold in his voice and his smile. I knew if I exploded in that room, I would lose everything. So I kept quiet, counted my breaths, and decided that if he wanted a showdown, I would bring evidence he could not dodge. I am a 28-year-old man, and for months I had been living inside a single project that promised to change my department and maybe change my career. When my manager first assigned it, I thought it would be another routine effort that would end up buried in a shared folder no one ever opened again. Then I started mapping the problem. I saw how many teams were bleeding time because our workflows were clumsy and our data redundant. I realized we were spending money to move the same numbers around in circles. It made me angry. It also made me ambitious. If I could streamline this, if I could quantify the savings and demonstrate a path to deliver them, I might finally step out from the background. I am not the loudest voice in the room. I am the person who reads the document twice and then fixes the errors inside the spreadsheet that no one else noticed. People like me keep things standing. People like Daniel get thanked for standing near the thing that is standing. The office looked glossy from the outside. Glass walls. Plants that somehow survived the air conditioning. Lanyards with metallic logos. Inside, it was a quiet race for attention. There were not many chances to present directly to the board. When you got one, you either made it count or you kept your head down for another year hoping someone would remember your last win. I learned early that competence alone rarely turned into recognition. To be recognized, you needed a moment under the lights. This project was going to be my moment. I felt it. I wanted it. I kept going. I built models that mapped our process from intake to delivery. I cut the fat and recorded the impact. I reached out to vendors for trial integrations. I negotiated temporary licenses for sandboxes. I did the tedious work of documenting every day so I would not lose track of small insights that might become giant savings. I created dashboards that turned an ocean of numbers into a story an executive could follow in 3 minutes. Every night I told myself to stop at 10. I usually looked up and saw it was close to 1. Coffee became my fourth language. My body forgot the meaning of weekends. The first time I showed a prototype to my manager, she blinked and said this might actually work. It felt like someone had opened a window in a stale room. I felt air. I sent a summary to her and she forwarded it to the director with a single line that said we should show this at the next board review. My chest glowed for an hour. I did not tell anyone else because I did not want to jinx it. That was the week Daniel began hovering. Daniel is 32. He is easy with people. He walks into a meeting late and everyone forgives him because he knows how to make a joke at his own expense that sounds like a compliment to himself. He is good at being seen, and he is even better at making his proximity look like contribution. If a slide is perfect, he will nod and say he likes the aesthetic of my slide, and by the end of the week people are telling each other that Daniel really drove the storytelling. I never hated him. I just did not count on him. When the project started to matter to leadership, he started to matter to me in the way a crossing guard matters to a person trying to sprint down a sidewalk. He asked me how the data connector worked. He asked me what library I used to render the animations on my dashboard. He asked to see the early workflow diagram because he said he liked the way I built the branches. I gave him answers. I did not give him the whole thing because I did not think he needed it. I also did not think he could do anything with it. I underestimated him in one crucial way. He did not need to do the work. He only needed to learn enough of the language to make it sound like he had traveled to the country. I kept bricklaying. I kept editing. I kept saving every new version with a proper date. I learned the habit from a manager who once told me that if it is not documented, then it never happened. I recorded emails with vendors in a folder titled Proof so I could quickly find the initial timestamps if ever I needed them. I took photographs of whiteboards after team huddles. I emailed myself notes with subject lines that would be easy to search. I did it because I am meticulous. I did it because I hate when work becomes a fog. I did it because it calms me. I had no idea I was building a shield. The week before the board meeting I started practicing the narrative. I wrote a script in my head. Problem, pain, process, proposal, projection. I said the 5 P words out loud like a chant while making breakfast. I timed the demo sequences so I could show impact without drowning people in details. I designed 3 slides with numbers big enough that even the board member at the far end would not squint. I practiced answers for the 2 executives who are famous for interrupting. I wrote notes to myself that said do not oversell because the numbers already sell. I walked around my living room at midnight rehearsing the phrase, we estimate these changes will save approximately 9,000 labor hours a year, and my neighbor probably learned the number by heart. The morning of the meeting I woke before my alarm. I shaved too carefully and still managed to nick my chin. I put on the tie that I wear only on days when I need to feel like a person who knows exactly what he is doing. I carried my laptop like a musician carries a favorite instrument. When I reached the conference room, the glass walls looked taller. The table looked longer. People took their seats with the attention of a theater audience. The executive director read the agenda and did the thing where he taps his pen against the folder as if to signal that we are all adults. My project was listed after the financial update and before a new hiring policy. I could feel sweat on my ribs. I listened to the finance lead deliver numbers with the voice of a news anchor. He finished. The director nodded. He said the name of my project as he moved his finger down the page. He looked up. I inhaled. Daniel stood. For a second, my mind treated it as a glitch. He was walking to the front with the clicker. The big screen showed the title of my deck, the cover image that I chose, the color accent I chose. He greeted the board with the confidence of a man who had practiced in the mirror. He began to speak. The first paragraph out of his mouth was mine. I recognized the cadence. I recognized the turn of phrase that I thought was too clever but let stand. He moved to the second slide, and I watched the 5P framework appear. He explained the pain points. He explained the process map. He guided them through the proposal. He used my projection slide, and he paused on the number because even he understood the theater of a well-placed silence. The executives leaned forward. They nodded. They looked at each other like people who are already spending the saved money in their heads. My manager tilted her head and shot a quick glance at me as if to say, "Is this a joke?" I felt my face set like wet concrete drying too fast. I did not move. I did not breathe. I did not speak. I counted the beats between Daniel's sentences, because if I did not count, I would stand and ruin myself. The chief operating officer asked a question about data integrity. Daniel smiled and delivered an answer I had given him 2 weeks earlier, when he asked me hypothetically how we guaranteed the accuracy of merged records. He used my analogy about double-locked doors in a digital hallway. People laughed. It sounded like something he would say because he was saying it. He moved his hands the way he moves his hands when he thinks he is being wise. He looked like a man who deserved to be congratulated. I could hear my pulse in my ears. I looked down at my hands and noticed that my knuckles were white from clenching. Another executive asked about the rollout. Daniel described a pilot and a training plan. He used the term adoption curve. And I felt a sharp heat behind my eyes because I remember typing that term in a draft and deleting it and then putting it back. Because I told myself, do not be precious about words when the numbers are strong. 10 minutes later, the director thanked him. He asked if there were any final questions. A board member who rarely speaks said this is exactly the kind of initiative we need to scale across the company. Then the room did what rooms do. People pushed back their chairs. They smiled. They moved on. I was left with this feeling like I had fallen through a trap door while everyone else stayed on the stage. After the meeting, Daniel shook hands and joked with the finance lead about how maybe he should be given a raise out of the savings he just created. My tongue felt heavy. I walked back to my desk with the motion of a person underwater. I closed my laptop because I could not look at the screen without seeing my slides reflected like a crime scene photograph. When I drove home that evening, I missed my exit and ended up circling the long way because my brain kept replaying the moment he first said good morning to the board as if he belonged there. I sat in my apartment in the dark and stared at the wall until the wall blurred. I thought about resigning. I thought about taking everything I had done and uploading it to a personal archive and walking away to a different company where maybe people would meet me as a person instead of a pair of quiet hands. I also thought about the vendor who set aside time for me and how I promised to follow up. I thought about the models I built and how they were mine. The anger gathered itself into a hard shape. It was not the kind of anger that makes you throw something. It was the kind that makes you pick up a pen. I opened my laptop. I created a folder titled Timeline. I started with the earliest artifact related to this project, a calendar invitation from 9 months ago when my manager asked me to scope an initial feasibility check. I exported it as a PDF with the original timestamp preserved. I added the email chain where I requested dataset access. I added the first dashboard sketch I sent to myself because I was embarrassed to share it and only wanted to keep it as a personal marker. I added the vendor demo confirmation. I added the trial license key email. I added screenshots of Slack messages where I asked for sign-off on a test. I added a photo of the whiteboard sketch from a meeting where I stood there drawing the intake funnel while Daniel doodled a geometric pattern in the corner. I added the scripted talking points I wrote for myself on a Sunday morning. I gathered more than 100 items. I tagged them by theme so I could find things quickly. I numbered them. I wrote a summary explaining each artifact with neutral language, because I knew that in a fight like this, facts beat adjectives. I printed some of it because I have seen how people behave differently when paper sits in front of them, like a small stack of truth. I placed the physical proof in a neat folder and slid it into my bag. I backed up the digital archive to 2 locations because I am paranoid when something matters. It was past 2 in the morning when I stopped. I closed the laptop. I stared at the ceiling and decided I would not explode. I would not send a furious midnight email that could be forwarded around the company with snide remarks. I would do this right. I would be the person the facts deserved. The next day I arrived early because I wanted a quiet hallway. I asked my manager if she had 10 minutes for a private conversation. She opened her door. I sat down and placed the folder on the desk without drama. I said, I want to walk you through something that happened yesterday. I spoke slowly. I told her that the project Daniel presented was mine. I said the line without heat because I did not want her to react to my emotion. I wanted her to react to the evidence. She raised an eyebrow the way people do when they hear something that is either going to be a misunderstanding or a fire. I opened the folder. I showed her the calendar. I showed her the early drafts with saved dates. I showed her the vendor emails. I showed her the Slack messages. I explained the provenance of the projection slide and the fact that I had created it weeks before Daniel asked me how I calculated the savings. I placed a printout next to another printout so she could see how the sentences he spoke matched the notes I wrote to myself. My manager is good at reading. She does not pretend to misunderstand when the picture is clear. As she moved through the stack, I watched her hands slow down. She reached the whiteboard photo and recognized her own handwriting in the margin next to my diagram. She arrived at the draft deck with metadata that included my name and the creation date. She looked up at me. She asked me if I was sure I wanted to escalate. I said yes. I said I understand the implications. I said I understand that once this starts, it will not be a small HR chat. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, leave the folder with me. She said, forward the digital archive to my private work address and copy legal. She said, do not discuss this with anyone else for now. She said, we will handle it properly. I nodded. I walked back to my desk and felt my body shaking after the adrenaline left. I ate a granola bar without tasting it. When Daniel arrived, he wore a grin that made me want to walk to the parking lot and scream into the wind. He stood by the coffee machine and asked me how I felt after such a big win for the team. I told him I was tired. He told me to pace myself because the rollout would be intense. He winked like we were partners in a secret. I opened my inbox and saw a reply from legal acknowledging receipt of the materials. The words "we will review and advise" felt like a hand on my shoulder. I kept working. I kept updating my documentation because if a fight is coming, you do not down tools. You sharpen them. At lunch, a coworker told me Daniel had asked if he could borrow a template I once used on a different project because he liked my structure. I thought about how there are people who watch you build a house and then ask for the key. I thought about how often that succeeds because the builder is too tired to argue. I was not going to be too tired. That evening, my manager called me into her office. She told me she had spoken to the director. She told me there would be a follow-up session with a subset of the board to go deeper into the numbers since they were excited and wanted more detail for budget planning. She looked at me and said, I will be asking you to present. She also said, do not share this plan with anyone yet. I knew what she was doing. She was creating the space where proof would meet theater. She was setting the stage for the truth to be seen, not just told. I walked out feeling both scared and ready. I went home and rehearsed again, not because I did not know the material, but because I wanted to scrub any remaining panic from my voice. I practiced looking up from my screen and making eye contact with the imaginary person who always sits near the window. I practiced pausing at the right moments. I practiced saying my name at the start because I wanted them to attach the work to a person. The next morning, Daniel sent a calendar invite titled Rollout Sync. He invited half the department and placed himself as the organizer. He wrote a description about aligning on ownership. I declined the meeting and forwarded the invite to my manager with a short note that said, I believe this is premature given our pending discussion. She replied with a single sentence that said, agreed, I will handle. 2 hours later, the invite disappeared from everyone's calendar. Daniel walked past my desk with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He said, we need to stay coordinated. I said, we will. He said, communication is key. I said, I agree. He leaned in and lowered his voice as if we were sharing a joke and said, big rooms can be confusing. Sometimes people mix up names in the excitement. I stared at him until he felt the stare. Then I said, sometimes people mix up names on purpose. He laughed too loudly and walked away. I sent myself a summary of the conversation because every thread counts. The day before the follow-up session, I received an email from the director's assistant with the agenda. My name was listed as the presenter. The email also included a note asking me to bring any relevant supporting documentation in case the board wanted to see how we validated the numbers. I breathed out for the first time in days. I knew what to bring, I knew how to bring it. I knew that even if someone tried to interrupt, I could put a document on the table and let it speak. That night I slept for 4 hours and woke with a clear head. I wore the same suit because it had done nothing wrong. I arrived early again and set up the demo environment with the care of a person arranging evidence on a court table. 5 executives took their seats. My manager sat at the side. The director nodded at me and said, "Let's see it." I introduced myself with my name and role. I told a short story about the first time I noticed the redundancy in our workflow. I made sure every sentence landed like a coin on a table. I presented the numbers, I showed the demo. I placed the printed timeline in a neat stack and explained that the appendix included vendor confirmations, draft dates, and communications that established authorship. I kept my tone even. I let the facts do the lifting. I finished with a projection slide. The room was quiet the way rooms are when a thing becomes obvious. The director thanked me. He looked at my manager. He looked at the stack of paper. He said, "We will be in touch." I packed up my laptop with hands that did not shake. I walked back to my desk and opened a blank document to write down everything that had just happened, because accuracy fades even if you think you will never forget a moment like that. I hit save and stared at the file name. I realized I was breathing like a person who had run a race and made it past the finish line without looking back. Update 1. That afternoon, my manager called me in and told me directly that leadership had seen enough to treat this as a serious integrity issue. She asked me to send the full digital archive once more to a dedicated legal channel and to prepare a concise summary of key timestamps. I spent the next hour compiling a clean timeline with hyperlinks. I attached the earliest calendar invite, the first draft deck with metadata, the vendor emails showing my name and dates, the Slack screenshots where Daniel asked me to explain mechanisms he later described as his. I wrote a neutral 1-page cover note explaining that my goal was not revenge but accurate attribution and proper delivery. My manager read it and said, "This is exactly the tone we need." She told me to keep my head down and to avoid any confrontation with Daniel. I nodded. I went back to my desk and worked. At 5:30, a calendar ping announced a special session scheduled for 2 days later with the director, legal, my manager, and Daniel. My name was on the invite as presenter. I stared at the screen and felt a calm settle over me. I knew what to bring. I knew what to say. I knew that if Daniel wanted a spotlight, he would get one. Only this time the light would be bright enough to show the fingerprints on every slide he stole. 2 days later, I walked into the conference room with the folder under my arm and my laptop already logged in. Daniel was sitting at the table in his usual confident posture, legs crossed, hands folded, smile fixed like he had already won. The director entered with legal counsel. My manager took a seat at the side. The air felt different from the quarterly board meeting. This was smaller, sharper, less theater and more judgment. The director asked me to begin. I opened the presentation and spoke calmly. I explained the problem. I explained the solution. I showed the documentation. I laid out the timeline of drafts, emails, and saved versions. I pointed to messages where Daniel asked me for explanations. I finished by saying that everything in front of them had been built by me from the start. I sat down. The silence stretched. Then the director turned to Daniel and asked if he had anything to add. Daniel laughed awkwardly. He said of course we had worked on it together. He said it was natural for teammates to share credit. He said maybe there was a misunderstanding. But the evidence on the table was not a misunderstanding. The director asked why every artifact listed only my name. Daniel said he had been busy coordinating other things. The director asked why Daniel had not listed himself as co-author in a single draft. Daniel shifted in his chair. He said he thought my name would cover both of us. The legal counsel asked him if he had any files or emails that demonstrated his authorship. Daniel hesitated. Then he admitted he did not. My manager spoke for the first time and said she had observed me building the system from the very beginning. She said Daniel had shown little involvement until the day of the board meeting. The room turned cold. Daniel's smile cracked. He tried to recover with another joke. No one laughed. Update 2. By the end of that week, Daniel was no longer employed at the company. There was no farewell lunch. No group card. One morning his desk was cleared, and by the afternoon people were whispering in the kitchen. Most of them admitted they were not surprised. Some said they had always wondered how he produced so much with so little effort. A few colleagues came to me privately and said they were glad I spoke up, because they too had lost credit to him in the past. For me, the aftermath was surreal. The board sent me a note of thanks for my presentation. My manager told me the project would continue under my leadership. My name was placed on the official roadmap as the owner. It was the recognition I had dreamed of, but it came wrapped in exhaustion. The stress had drained me, but it also left me stronger. When I walked through the office now, people greeted me differently. They looked at me as someone who had fought back and won. I did not brag. I did not need to. The facts had done the work. At night, I lay in bed and thought about how close I had come to losing everything. If I had shouted in the boardroom, I would have been dismissed as emotional. If I had stayed quiet forever, I would have been erased. But because I documented everything, because I trusted my work enough to defend it, I kept my project and my integrity. Daniel disappeared from our industry's radar. A year later, I heard he was struggling to find stable employment. People in our field talk, and his reputation followed him. I did not celebrate his downfall, but I did not mourn it either. Actions have consequences.